Clara is a physical destruction damage dealer. Most of Clara's value comes from her added survivability and counterattacks whenever she is hit by the enemy. The best thing about Clara is in theory her damage is uncapped because of her damage dealing nature. When in combat with this character, the enemy is your support. But what happens when they are no enemies? Then you become your worst enemy, and this is the weird state of Clara. Upon my first playthrough of Honkai Star Rail, which was during the final closed beta, the character I received was Clara. The interesting thing about this character is that she was deemed to be one of the best characters due to her sheer amount of damage output and survivability. I just didn't buy it because of how reactive her playstyle is. I guess my judgment of the character was false because she was to be nerfed leading into the game. The targeted nerfs would be to her overall survivability, which was too powerful for the early to mid game. In all honesty, if she wasn't nerfed in the first place, not much would change for the character, because it was a small tweak. And nowadays enemies hit extremely hard. Despite being a powerful character still leading into the launch of the game, Clara would be the character that flew completely under the radar. I mean, after all, she worked completely different from the cast of characters. You also had to design your team comp around her much like any other damage dealer. At the same time, she required unique supports to make the most use of her kit. Being one of the slowest base speed characters meant you'd virtually want 0 speed, and want to avoid using any characters that would give her action turn value or speed buffs. You also wanted her to be the character in the team with the highest taunt value possible. All of these circumstances would narrow her potential teammates to just a few options. Gracefully, those options would be 3 4-stars and potentially a 5-star depending on your knowledge of the game's fundamentals. March 7th being given early on made Clara a desirable banner character candidate, as the two had nice synergy from an early to mid game perspective. Sure, the two in the team won't hold up as well nowadays, but at the same time, Honkai Star was played completely different. March gave Clara the necessary extra taunt value and added survivability, which worked as well as it did because of Clara's personal increase of taunt values with her own increased survivability. If everything went according to plan, the two worked perfectly with just one another. But there would be just one issue. Honkai Star Rail's auto combat AI only knows 2 things: use damage buffs on the highest attack stat character and press ultimates whenever they're available. This programmed response isn't bad in itself, but only poses an issue for the Clara and March duo. You see, Clara always wants to be attacked to dish out damage due to her reactive playstyle, and as discussed earlier, if enemies aren't hitting you, it results in a massive DPS loss. March would freeze enemies on the AoE with her ultimate, which not only stopped enemies from taking action, but also delayed their actions further whenever they took their turn. This was easily preventable through manual play, but impossible with the auto battle feature. To make matters worse, March in theory could freeze without even using her ultimate via the counterattack she provided with her passive. While not being a consistent freeze, it was still an hindrance nonetheless for the duo. This was however dependent on the enemies having ice weaknesses. So to say the least, with March being a circumstantial best in slot ally for Clara teams, there would be 2 characters that provided more valuable buffs and made use of an interesting mechanic in Clara's kit. Even if enemies didn't hit Clara, there was an opportunity for you to counterattack the enemy depending on your ultimate enhanced counterattack number. Ting Yun would give a ton of energy to a single ally, and Clara's ultimate wasn't very expensive to charge regardless. So you'd be able to not only keep the ultimate increased taunt value for Clara, but you'd keep the damage uptime on the character with those enhanced counterattacks. Bronya's major contribution to the team was allowing Clara to retain the attack and crit damage buffs provided via ultimate due to the low base speed of Clara. If you wanted faster clears and some energy for even quicker ultimates on Clara, then you'd increase the action for Clara with Bronya. But this wasn't as advisable because you really wanted to retain those ultimate damage buffs Bronya provided. Also worth a mention, a fully buffed elemental skill coming from Clara could put out a nice chunk of damage. So the situation called for it, wasting a turn of buffs wasn't all too bad. This team, much like any other team that utilized 2 harmonies, will be known as Hyper Carry. Specifically, Clara Hyper Carry. Using Clara in the endgame yielded amazing results whenever there were many physical weak enemies. The only issue is that this wasn't as often as the other elements. Physical didn't and still does not have many physical characters, so Hoyo doesn't have much of a reason to sell these characters. More so than other characters and elements, this is the only case for Memories of Chaos, as later on Pure Fiction changed a bunch of things. It's also worth noting that Clara works best in scenarios when she's guaranteed to have counters without utilizing supports that give her ultimate energy. In other words, if there's many enemies on the field, Clara excels. And if there is any enemies that hit multiple allies at once, Clara will also excel. So what we would have is a completely situational damage dealer, and this will leave Clara to be a character that would remain an underdog in Star Rail. There would also be a subset of players that couldn't be bothered to use Clara because of how she fundamentally goes against the Memories of Chaos design. Clara dealt most of her damage via counters, and her base speed was extremely low. so you take very little turns in the overall fight with the character. This meant that the subset of players that enjoy getting clears as quickly as possible for the endgame would despise this character even more. This was known as zero cycling, and is honestly executed in a unique fashion that ignored the game's fundamentals, which wasn't achievable for every player. So no matter what character was to release in Honkai Star Rail, the usage of Clara would never change. It always remained the same even to this day, hence why I called her the underdog of Star Rail. So with that being said, let's skip time a little bit. 1.3 second half would release a 4-star defensive option that gave a massive performance boost to Clara teams. This character will later on have many more ways of easy accessibility for the common player, but at the time suffered the fate of Banner 4-star, the RNG aspect of the gacha. So despite Lynx being an amazing character paired alongside Clara even to this day, at the time not every player had her. For those that did, you had a combo that was inseparable. Increased taunt for Clara with a survivability buff, further cleansing that combo nicely with Clara's built-in cleansing, and an attack buff depending on how fortunate you were with the character at the gacha at the time. This made not only the March duo look bleak, but any other 5-star pairing because of the utility Lynx provided. It was just what Clara needed. Even though this was an overall performance boost for Clara, characters like Daniel at the time overshadowed her, with, as I said earlier in the video, the faster clears. Second half of the next patch would feature Topaz as the rate-up character. Her gimmick was being a follow-up attacker that boosted the damage of follow-up attacks for allies as well. This meant Clara would quickly become one of her best teammates. Clara had single target counters, but adjacent hitting enhanced counterattacks, which meant the bulk of her damage would target the main enemy. That damage would be boosted up by the follow-up attack damage debuff Topaz would put onto enemies of her choosing. And if we consider that these two would contribute towards the overall team damage, it would feel as if it was a dream come true pairing. The release of Topaz would further prove one thing though. This still wouldn't be enough to give Clara a shake up to the meta or even a sizable increase in usage, because to be quite honest, most players skipped Topaz. Her debut banner revenue was living proof of that. It also didn't help that another destruction character had a banner prior to Topaz, and that same character had the fastest memories of Chaos Clear we had seen yet, which further reiterated the weird state of Clara. There would be one last major update to Clara's performance in the immediate future, which was the release of the follow-up attack set in 1.5. This new relic set gave a nice boost for follow-up attacks and gave a massive stacking attack boost depending on your follow-up attack hits, which gave Clara an actual substantial amount of damage increase from her previously used relic set. It also helped that in the same team of Topaz, who also helped with the overall team damage, saw a major damage increase from the release of this same relic set. Still, this wouldn't be enough to prove the masses to build and utilize Clara once more. The nail in the coffin for the destruction of Clara's exclusivity would be the followed release of Argenti in the same patch. Argenti was a physical erudition character that had the best AoE damage output in a kit that had zero flaws. It flowed so effortlessly. Argenti's kit would prove to be even more beneficial following the release Pure Fiction that benefited AoE damage dealers. Argenti's energy gain was much better than Clara's, and he utilized the same harmony that Clara did. Around this time period, the best supports for Clara would change from harmony to other damage dealers anyways, but Ting Yun was still very valuable for her nonetheless. Much like Argenti, however, Clara also excels on AoE content because that meant theoretical uncapped damage potential because of how many counterattacks she could pull off. Even though Argenti was superior and Clara had more means of accessibility, she would still remain an underdog even in the endgame, as there were other AoE characters you could also use. It also didn't help that Argenti had an amazing character design aesthetically, but that's just my opinion after all. Later on, Dr. Ratio would arrive and be given to the player for free following his debut banner in the second half of 1.6. Considering Dr. Ratio was a limited character that utilized follow-up attacks, he had the damage of a limited character, and proved himself to be a much better pairing of Topaz than did Clara. Survival of the fittest in its entirety. The last major update to Clara's performance at the time of recording would actually be the release of Sparkle following the second half of 2.0. As for the reasons, well, Sparkle allowed characters with backloaded damage to retain every single buff that she provided, comparative to Bronya that she only gave half. So Clara would see a massive damage increase much like any other follow-up attack character, but it also meant the limelight was on Jing, as he utilized Sparkle too and is a much more popular character. Jing also utilized Topaz too, which meant his teams would outperform Clara's teams in every single scenario. Clara wasn't bad by any means, just still very much so situational. You also notice that this would be the first time I hadn't mentioned Ruame being an overall buff to the character being discussed, and that's because of the anti-synergy these two had with one another. So for those of you that don't know, Clara, much like the situation with March, would prefer if enemies were not being rendered unable to attack via being CC'd. And considering Ruame had much more long-lasting crowd control in her kit, these two would feel as the most anti-synergistic pairing in the whole game. At the time of recording, Robin will release as the upcoming Harmony Limited character in the first half of 2.2. Robin has a lot of buffing capabilities for damage dealers across the board, but pairs exceptionally well with characters that have follow-up attacks, meaning Clara should see a nice buff following the release of this character. Will Robin be enough to boost boost the morale of the player, or will Clara still remain the underdog of Honkai Star Rail? I honestly don't know. What I do know is despite all of these circumstances Clara has found herself in, when the situation calls for her, she has the potential to carry your endgame run. So there you have it. Clara has never had her time to shine really, because she has never been the first option for many players in any scenario. If this was Pokemon, Clara would have a very interesting niche, but there's no such thing as trick room mechanics that inverses the speed for the match. But even then, considering how Clara works as a character, that may actually be a hindrance. Also important to note, the faster enemies become, the better it is for Clara, as that means even more chances to be hit by the enemy. We'll see if that comes to fruition though. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day.